I had always dreamed of a quiet and cozy house, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. When Martin suggested we move to the suburbs, I agreed immediately. We found the perfect house, overlooking the park, and it felt as if life had finally reached that harmony I had dreamed of for so long. Spacious, bright, with large windows, our new home seemed to whisper that everything would now be all right. We would have time for each other, and perhaps we would finally find that lost connection that had slipped away in recent times. The first days in our new home were filled with joy, but also with a strange sense of emptiness. Martin was immersed in his work, as usual, and the move didn't change much of his schedule. He left early in the morning and returned late at night, while I stayed alone among boxes and the smell of fresh paint. But during those days, I even found something comforting in that solitude. Time to get used to the new place, to put everything in order. One of our first neighbors was Victor, the man who lived across the street, tall with slightly graying hair and a gentle, constant smile on his lips. There was something about him, a kind of freedom and lightness that caught my attention from the very first moment. We met by chance when I was trying to carry some boxes into the house. He came over and offered his help. "Are you new to the neighborhood?" Victor asked with interest, his slight accent betraying his southern roots. "Yes, we moved in yesterday," I replied with a smile, feeling a bit awkward at his kindness. And that's how our friendship began. Victor turned out to be an architect who often worked from home. He was always friendly and willing to help. One day Martin was late at work, and I discovered that the kitchen faucet was broken. After several failed attempts to fix it myself, I called Victor without thinking twice. In a matter of minutes, he was at my door with a set of tools and his ever-relaxed smile. "This is a minor thing. I'll fix it quickly," he said as he examined the faucet. I watched him, surprised by how naturally he handled every situation. Unlike Martin, who was always absorbed in his work and stressed, Victor seemed carefree, as if life presented no problems for him. "Thank you," I said when the faucet was finally fixed. "Martin is always busy, and I wouldn't even know when we'd have managed to fix it without your help." "Well, you can count on me whenever you need something," Victor smiled, looking at me a little longer than necessary. From that day on, we started talking more often. At first, our conversations were brief about life, the weather, or the house. But over time, I realized I enjoyed his company more and more. Our chats grew longer, and his presence became more familiar and pleasant. With Victor, I felt light, as if everything around me became a little brighter and simpler. Of course, I attributed it to a simple friendship. Martin worked a lot, and I just needed someone to talk to. Victor was that neighbor with whom I could chat about anything. But something in his attentive eyes and gentle gestures began to unsettle me more and more. After the first few days of getting to know Victor, I gradually got used to our new rhythm of life. Martin, as always, kept disappearing into his work, and our nights became quieter and more monotonous. I missed the spark that had once existed in our relationship, but I tried to convince myself that it was a normal stage of marriage. We were both adults, and this kind of phase happens in any couple. However, life began to fill with something new. Victor started to appear more frequently, sometimes for a reason, sometimes just to chat. He'd stop by for a cup of coffee or just for a moment to tell me about new projects or ideas. It all seemed completely natural and I didn't think much of it. I had always loved my work as an interior designer, but I often missed having colleagues with whom I could discuss fresh ideas or project challenges. Victor, being an architect, suggested that we sometimes discuss our professional topics. At first, they were light conversations about the latest trends in design and architecture, but over time, they became more serious discussions about potential joint projects. Have you ever thought about working with someone as a team? He asked me one day while we were sitting in my living room and I was showing him some of my ideas for decorating the house. Sometimes I dream about it, but I rarely find someone with whom I could truly create something interesting, I replied, smiling. Usually my projects revolve more around the clients than my own ideas. And you? Don't you also prefer working alone? Victor gave a slight, thoughtful smile. Yes, but lately I've started to feel that working alone can be quite lonely. With your ideas, it would be interesting to work together. We could create something authentic, something that goes beyond conventional projects. His words touched something deep within me. The idea of working alongside Victor began to linger more and more in my mind. He had that vision that inspired me, and I began to look at him with newfound admiration. Our conversations, which at first were merely professional, were becoming increasingly personal, sometimes with subtle hints of flirtation that I tried to ignore. One day, Victor came to see me with a new idea for a project. We spent several hours in my office discussing details, sketching ideas, and joking about little things. At some point, I realized that his presence beside me had become something everyday and desired. It was so easy to be with him, so inspiring. And even though my thoughts sometimes drifted into dangerous territory, I convinced myself that it was just friendship, nothing more. However, everything changed the day Martin was very late at work, and Victor came over to my house again to discuss some detail of the project. We were sitting in the kitchen laughing about how absurd some of our clients' interior designs could be. But there was something different in his gaze that day, deeper, more intense. I felt something forming between us that I could no longer ignore. When he accidentally brushed my hand, a shiver ran through my body like an electric shock. The contact was brief, but it caused a strange tension in me. My heart stopped for a second and a thought crossed my mind. What just happened? I quickly looked away and tried to focus again on the conversation. But from that moment, our chats and meetings were no longer the same. Every time I saw Victor, I realized I was thinking about him more than I wanted to admit. I tried to convince myself that it was all a game of my imagination, that it was just a friendly connection, that I was exaggerating in my thoughts. But every day it became harder. Victor was too close, too attentive. And although I hadn't fully admitted it yet, something inside me had already changed. Several weeks passed since Victor and I began working on the project, and our meetings had become almost routine. I tried not to give importance to the tension that arose between us, convincing myself that they were just work-related moments. Martin, as always, was immersed in his work and arrived home too late to notice any change in my behavior. One night, Martin decided to organize a dinner for our friends. It was one of those rare events where we could disconnect from daily worries and spend time together. He invited several of our mutual friends, and to my surprise, includes Victor on the guest list. I thought it would be nice for Victor to meet our friends, Martin explained when I gave him a surprised look at seeing the list. After all, he's your colleague on the project and also our neighbor. We should get to know him better. I nodded, but inside I felt a strange sense of unease. Having Victor in the same circle as Martin and our friends was unexpected. I couldn't shake the feeling that this would be a test of my self-control. The evening arrived quickly. As usual, Martin took care of the organization and cooking, while I handled setting the table and creating a cozy atmosphere. The guests began to arrive, and when Victor appeared, I felt my heart start to beat faster. "Hello, Julia," he said with that smile that always made me feel a bit uncomfortable. "What a lovely evening. I'm glad to be here." "I'm glad you came," I responded, trying to stay calm. Throughout the evening, Victor was attentive and kind, as usual. He socialized easily with our friends, joked with Martins, and kept the conversation going as if he were an old family friend. But every time his gaze lingered on me, I felt that same tension rising between us that I worked so hard to ignore. At some point in the night, Martin invited everyone to sit down at the table. We sat across from each other and everything went as usual. Laughter, conversations, wine. But inside me, everything was boiling. I felt that Martin was noticing my behavior, but I tried not to show my true feelings. Victor, on the other hand, remained calm as always, as if the situation didn't matter to him at all. When dinner was coming to an end and the guests began to say their goodbyes, I walked Victor to the door. We looked at each other for a moment, and in those brief seconds, it seemed like we had many things left unsaid. "Thank you for the evening," he said softly, holding my gaze. For a moment longer, I thanked him that Martin had invited him, responding with a smile, trying to keep the tone light. "I am glad I came," he replied briefly, and with that he left, leaving me with a heavy feeling. When the door closed behind him, I returned to the living room where Martin was clearing the table. His expression was serious. "You've spent too much time with Victor," he said suddenly without looking up. Those words struck me deeply. I stood still, feeling the tension inside me reach its peak. "Are you jealous?" I asked uncertainly, trying to give my voice a playful tone, but inside I was in knots. Martin raised his head and looked at me in surprise. "No, of course not," he replied. But there was a note of doubt in his voice. "It's just that you're always with him. I thought it was just a work relationship, but it seems you've become very close." I froze, unsure of how to respond. A wave of guilt washed over me. Martin's words were too close to the truth I was trying to hide from myself. "It's just work, Martin," I replied quickly, moving closer to him, trying to reassure him. "We only talk about the projects, nothing more." He nodded, but his gaze remained distrustful. I knew this conversation wasn't over. For the first time in a long time, I realized that something really was changing between Victor and Ma. A few days passed since that unfortunate dinner, but the tension at home didn't dissipate. Martin became more reserved, and his attention to the details of my behavior only intensified. I felt it in every look, in every gesture. Even though he tried not to mention Victor, our conversations became shorter, and the few moments we spent together at home were tense. Inside me, a sense of anguish was growing. I understood that our relationship was fracturing, and it was my fault. One morning, when Martin was already at work, I received a message from Victor. It was short and unusual. "Julia, can you come over? I'm not feeling well." My heart started to beat faster immediately. A mix of worry and nervousness overwhelmed me. Something wasn't right, and I decided not to delay. I quickly put on a jacket and headed to his house, which was just across the street. As I walked, my thoughts tormented me. What was wrong? Why had he texted me? I tried to push any suspicion out of my mind and focus on one thing: helping a friend. Victor's door was slightly ajar. I entered the house and silence enveloped me immediately, only interrupted by the gentle hum of the fan. Victor was lying on the couch. He looked weak, his face pale, his gaze vacant, and I quickly ran to him. "Victor, what's wrong?" I asked, sitting beside him and taking his hand. "You look terrible. Should I call a doctor?" He opened his eyes and gave me a tired smile. "No need for a doctor. I just overheated in the sun yesterday. Now I feel awful. Thank you for coming." I placed my hand on his forehead to check his temperature. In that moment, I noticed how his eyes focused on my face, studying every detail. It wasn't just a look. There was something more, something I had felt for a long time but didn't want to admit. "You have a fever," I commented, trying to speak calmly, but something inside me trembled. I stood up to get some water, but his hand gently grasped my wrist, stopping me. I froze, feeling a chill run through me. In that moment, as our gazes locked, I understood that there were no more boundaries between us. "Julia," Victor whispered. His voice was soft, filled with those feelings we had both been hiding for so long. And before I could process what was happening, he leaned towards me and kissed me, gently but decisively. It was a moment that lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. I didn't pull away, I couldn't. His lips were warm, his touch delicate, but it was full of the emotion we had been repressing. Suddenly, I pulled away, realizing what had just happened. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear my own thoughts. I stood up, stepping back, while Victor remained lying down, not trying to stop me. We shouldn't have," I began to stammer, trying to find the words, but I couldn't. He didn't reply, just looked at me with the same tenderness that only deepened my confusion. "I have to go," I said, trying to regain control of myself. I left his house quickly, feeling the anxiety growing inside me. The air outside seemed too dense. I could barely breathe from the torrent of thoughts and emotions flooding me. How had I let it happen? What am I doing? I had betrayed Martin, betrayed everything I believed in. But the worst part was that I couldn't forget that kiss. Even as I walked away from Victor's house, even as I tried to calm myself by telling myself it was a mistake, I could still feel his lips on mine. I realized that it wasn't an accident. It was a moment that had been brewing for a long time, but one I had refused to accept. When I returned home, I couldn't find peace. My reflection in the mirror seemed foreign, and the feeling of guilt weighed on me, giving me no rational justification. Martin would be back in a few hours, and I didn't know how I would face him after what had happened. I spent the entire day trying to convince myself it wouldn't happen again, that I had simply been carried away by emotions and that now it had to end. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be that easy. After that kiss, I found myself in a constant state of anxiety. My mind tried to dismiss what had happened as if it were a mistake that could be easily corrected, but with each passing day, I realized that the situation was spiraling out of control. I thought about cutting off our communication to protect my marriage and myself, but life had other plans. In the days that followed, I ignored his messages. Martin, as usual, left early for work. But now, when I was alone at home, the silence became unbearable. That silence reminded me of every moment I spent with Victor and how I had crossed the line I didn't want to acknowledge. I stayed firm. I didn't answer his calls or open the door if I heard his steps near the house. Of course, Martin sensed my tension, but he didn't ask questions. He seemed too absorbed in his work and trusted that our problems would resolve themselves if he gave me time. However, a barrier was growing between us. Our conversations had become superficial, brief, as if we both feared touching on any important topic. I felt my heart drifting away from him, and it tore me apart inside. One afternoon, Martin suggested we spend the weekend in nature, thinking it would be a good opportunity to regain our closeness. We went to his parents' cottage, surrounded by forests and a lake, to escape reality for a few days. It was supposed to be a kind of salvation for us, but the tension that had already taken root in our relationship didn't allow us to relax. At first, everything seemed fine. We sat by the lake, enjoyed the sunset, and Martin even tried to tell a joke that at another time would have made us both laugh. But now I only smiled weakly, realizing that I couldn't concentrate or feel at peace by his side. My mind kept drifting back to Victor. "You've been acting strange lately," Martin said, breaking the silence. His directness startled me. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to stay calm, though inside I felt a knot in my stomach. "You're distant. Has something happened? Are you having problems at work?" His voice was soft, as if he genuinely didn't understand what was going on. I couldn't tell him the truth. I couldn't confess that it was difficult for me to be close to him because every word, every look from him reminded me that I had betrayed him. Instead, I tried to deflect the conversation. "Everything's fine, Martin. I'm just tired. Maybe you're working a lot too, and we barely see each other. I guess everything has piled up. I just need some time." He nodded in silence, but I could tell he wasn't convinced by that explanation. Everything we once had become fragile and vulnerable. I couldn't admit it out loud, but I knew that the distance between us was growing with each passing day. That weekend didn't bring us the closeness I had hoped for. We returned home as much strangers to each other as when we had left. Martin returned to his routines, and I was left alone with my thoughts. Guilt consumed me, and at the same time I couldn't shake the growing desire to see Victor again. Despite my attempts to distance myself, Victor didn't give up. His messages kept coming, short and respectful, as if he knew I was avoiding him but didn't want to push anything. One of those messages came one night when Martin was once again working late. "Hi, Julia. We need to talk. I respect your decision if you want to end everything, but I think we should at least talk about it. Victor." Those few words made my heart beat faster. I knew I should keep ignoring him, but I couldn't. I knew there was more between us than just an accidental kiss. It was a connection that I couldn't break easily, no matter how hard I tried. I stared at my phone screen for a long time before mustering the courage to respond. Victor, I don't know what's happening with us. This shouldn't have happened. Give me time. But deep down, I knew time wouldn't change anything. The attraction to Victor wasn't just a fleeting passion. It was a feeling growing inside me like a storm ready to break at any moment. And then I understood that this struggle wasn't over yet. Shortly after our tense trip to the countryside, Martin left for a work conference for a week. When he told me, I felt a mix of relief and anxiety. Part of me was glad to have some time away from the constant tension and guilt towards my husband. But on the other hand, I knew that his absence would leave me without excuses to resist my desires and feelings towards Victor. The next morning, when Martin was already on his way, I felt strangely empty. The house felt even quieter and colder. I tried to focus on work, but thoughts of Victor haunted me at every moment. It was a strange mix of fear and desire that overshadowed all other emotions. That same night, I received a message from Victor. "Julia, can we meet? I respect your wish to keep some distance, but I need to talk to you." I stared at my phone screen for a long time before replying. My fingers trembled as I typed a brief response. "Come tomorrow morning." That night I barely slept. I tossed and turned in bed, tortured by conflicting thoughts. I knew meeting Victor was a mistake, but it was a mistake I couldn't stay away from. Too much had happened between us for me to stop now and forget everything. In the morning, as I got ready, I tried to distract myself with household chores. But with each passing hour, the tension inside me grew, and I couldn't focus on anything else. Finally, when I heard the doorbell, I felt my heart stop. I opened the door, and there stood Victor, calm, but his eyes mirrored the same emotions as mine. We stood there, staring at each other in silence for a few seconds before I stepped aside to let him in. "I'm glad you decided to see me," he said as soon as the door closed behind him. His voice was soft and cautious, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. "I'm glad too," I replied, trying to hide the tremor in my voice, "but I don't know how we should proceed." Victor moved closer, and in his gaze I saw the same passion I felt within myself. We both knew that the boundaries we had tried to establish had long been broken. "Julia, you know this isn't just a mistake," he said softly as he moved closer. "There is something real between us." I couldn't respond. My heart was pounding, and I could no longer resist. A moment later, he was so close that before I realized it, our lips met again. This time it wasn't casual or timid, but determined, deep, and there was no resistance in me. I let myself be carried away by him, allowing myself to forget everything in that instant. Our hands moved on their own as if they had always known what to do. We didn't say a word, we simply lost ourselves in that moment. In that instant, all reality disappeared. We were in that place where this unpredictable game had led us. Every touch from Victor, every look, gave me what I hadn't felt in my relationship with Martin for a long time. Freedom, a storm of emotions and energy I had lost long ago. We ended up in bed, and I could no longer think about right or wrong. In that moment, everything felt right. I allowed myself to feel everything, the emotion I had been repressing for so long. It wasn't just a physical encounter, it was a release I hadn't found in my marriage. Despite the pain I knew would follow, I enjoyed that moment. When everything ended and we lay together, breathing heavily, I understood there was no turning back. The world beyond that room returned, and with it came the harsh and unforgiving reality. What do we do now? I asked, breaking the silence. Victor turned to me. His expression was serious, but there was no fear or regret in his eyes. I don't know, Julia, he replied softly, but I know one thing. I don't regret any of the moments I spent with you. His words brought a new wave of conflicting emotions. I didn't know how to react. Thoughts about Martin, our marriage, about what had just happened tormented me. For the entire week that followed, I lived in a constant state of internal tension. After that night with Victor, the world around me changed. Everything seemed the same house, the same routine, but inside me a storm was raging. It was a feeling of guilt I couldn't suppress, and at the same time a burning desire to relive those moments of intimacy that had upended my life. Martin returned from his work trip without suspecting anything. I tried to act as if nothing had changed, as if everything was normal. But every word of his, every gesture hurt me deeply. I could no longer look him in the eye without remembering that night with Victor. Every time Martin touched me, my body tensed, and he noticed. "What's wrong, Julia?" he asked one morning over breakfast. "Since I came back, you've been different." I couldn't meet his eyes. My hands clenched, and I focused on the coffee cup in front of me. "Everything is fine, Martin. I've just been very busy with work," I replied, trying to sound calm. But he sensed there was more behind those words. He frowned but didn't push further. Still, his distrust grew each day. I saw it in his eyes, in how he began to watch my every move, as if trying to discover what was really happening. But I couldn't, nor did I want to, tell him the truth. I was too much of a coward to confess my betrayal, even though I knew he deserved to know. Meanwhile, Victor kept messaging me, and each message made my heart race. But I tried to respond coldly and briefly. Inside me, a constant battle raged. I knew I had to cut all contact with him, but I couldn't. The desire to see him again, to touch him, was too strong, and that only made my internal struggle intensify. I couldn't forgive myself for what I had done, but I couldn't stop thinking about Victor. One night, when Martin stayed late at work again, I was sitting in the kitchen, lost in my thoughts, when my phone vibrated. On the screen, a message from Victor appeared. "Julia, we need to talk. I can't go on like this." Those words struck me deeply. I knew he was right. We couldn't go on this way. But instead of replying, I got up from the table and put the phone in my pocket. I didn't know what to do. The pain of betrayal was destroying me from the inside, and I couldn't continue living this double life. When Martin returned home, I was sitting in the living room, trying to organize my thoughts. He noticed my state and came over, sitting beside me. "Julia, what's happening to us? I feel like you've distanced yourself. I can tell something has changed between us." His voice was full of concern, which only increased my guilt. I couldn't keep hiding it, and I covered my face with my hands, unable to hold back the pain. "Martin, I don't know how this happened," I began, sobbing. "I've done something I shouldn't have. I've betrayed you." He froze, his face turned pale, and I felt like the world around me was collapsing. My words had finally come to light, and it was a point of no return. "What? What are you saying?" He spoke slowly, his voice trembling with disbelief. I could no longer hide the truth. I told him everything. Our meetings with Victor, how we grew closer, and that night I could never forget. Martin listened in silence, his face blank, devoid of emotion. I watched as each word plunged him deeper into his thoughts, realizing our marriage was broken. When I finished, silence filled the room. Martin didn't move. He just sat there staring at a fixed point. His eyes seemed empty and his face lifeless. "I can't," he finally spoke quietly, getting up from the couch. "I can't believe you've done this. You've destroyed everything." He started pacing back and forth as if he couldn't find a place to be, his hands trembling. I wanted to say something, to try to justify myself, but I knew there were no words that could fix what had happened. "I can't stay with you, Julia," he said. His voice was cold and determined. "I won't be able to forget it. I won't be able to forgive you." With those words, Martin left the house, leaving me alone in a devastating silence. I stayed sitting in the same spot, feeling reality crush me. In a single moment, I had lost everything. My husband, my family, the hope of being forgiven. Martin didn't return that night. My betrayal had ended our marriage, and I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. After Martin left, the house sank into an overwhelming silence that seemed to absorb everything. I remained seated on the couch, not knowing what to do, feeling empty inside, as if someone had taken all my emotions, leaving only pain. A silent but corrosive pain. Martin didn't come back. Not that night nor the next day. He was gone, and I knew he never wanted to see me again. On the third day after he left, I tried to contact him, but his phone was off. I sent him several messages that were never read. I understood that Martin wanted to disappear from my life completely, and it tore my heart to pieces. Despite all the pain, despite the betrayal, a part of me still clung to the hope that maybe we had a chance to fix things. But every day without his response was another blow to that hope. During those days, Victor kept trying to reach me. His messages were persistent, but I ignored them. After Martin learned the truth, I felt empty, guilty towards him and towards myself. I couldn't be with Victor anymore. Despite the feelings that still lived inside me, my betrayal had destroyed my marriage, and I didn't want to destroy more lives. After several days, I finally decided to meet Victor to end this story. We met at his place. When I arrived, his face reflected hope, as if he still believed there could be something between us. But in my heart, there was only guilt. "Thank you for coming," he said softly as he approached me, his eyes searching mine, trying to understand what I was thinking. I nodded, avoiding his gaze. "Victor, I came to end everything," I said, gathering the courage to speak. "I can't continue this. I destroyed my marriage, and I need time to sort out my life. I can't be with you knowing that all of this is the result of my betrayal." He stepped back, his face frozen in an expression of disappointment and pain. "You want to end everything?" he asked softly, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Yes," I replied, trying to keep my emotions under control. "I can't keep lying to myself or to others. This wasn't just a mistake, Victor. It was a betrayal. I can't live with it. I can't continue our relationship knowing the harm I've caused Martin. All of this was a mistake." His eyes filled with despair, but he said nothing more. We stood in silence, a pause that seemed eternal. I could see he didn't want to let me go, that our relationship meant something to him. But I could no longer live in a lie. "I'm sorry, Victor," I whispered, turning towards the door. When I left his house, the feeling of relief unexpectedly transformed into a deep emptiness. I knew I had made the right decision, but I also understood that I was now completely alone. Martin wouldn't come back to me, and my bond with Victor had been broken forever. The next day, Martin returned home, but not to talk. He came to collect his things. I tried to talk to him. I asked him if we could have a conversation, but his eyes remained cold and indifferent. He didn't say a word. He just packed his belongings and headed for the door. At the threshold, he paused for a moment without looking at me. "I'm going to file for divorce. I don't want to hear from you again." Those words pierced me like a knife. I knew I had lost everything, but hearing it from his mouth was too painful. I couldn't find the strength to say anything to him. He left, and in that moment I understood that our marriage had officially come to an end. The woman I once was no longer existed. After that, my life seemed to come to a halt. I woke up each morning feeling how the pain spread inside me like a silent, endless wave. Every memory of Martin, every thought about what we had been, made me shudder with pain. I had lost him, and it was all my fault. Victor tried to contact me again, but I couldn't respond anymore. I knew that continuing our relationship wouldn't bring me happiness. It would only increase my guilt, and he understood that too. Not long after Martin collected his things, Victor stopped messaging. He realized there was no future for us. Now I was alone in our house, which felt empty and cold. The home that had once been filled with dreams about the future had become the place where everything ended. I knew my actions had brought me here, that I had destroyed my life and the lives of those I loved. Weeks went by, and the silence that filled the house after Martin's departure became part of my new reality. Every morning, waking up in bed, I looked at the empty side where my husband used to sleep and understood that I was alone now. Loneliness wrapped around me like a suffocating fog, and it felt like, with each passing day, I sank deeper into that state of despair. My attempts to put my life back together were failing. The sense of existence had vanished, and I could no longer find the strength to keep fighting. Martin filed for divorce shortly after leaving home. The documents arrived in the mail, cold and official. A reminder that everything I once thought was eternal had been destroyed. I sat at the kitchen table holding those papers, feeling something inside me crumble. I couldn't hold back the tears, knowing that this was the end of our love, our plans for the future, our life together. I signed the documents without disputing anything. Martin had every right to take whatever he wanted. After all I did, I had no moral right to fight for anything. As expected, Victor also disappeared from my life. In the early days after our breakup, he kept trying to stay in touch, but my silent responses made it clear to him that our relationship had no future. With each passing day, his messages became less frequent until they eventually stopped. I knew his interest in me had been driven by the passion we had shared, but now that that passion had faded, we had nothing left in common. Being left alone, I began to realize how much I had underestimated my happiness with Martin. I was convinced that our relationship had lost its spark long ago, that I deserved something more, that my attraction to Victor was an opportunity for something new, but I was wrong. It was a mistake that destroyed my life and Martin's. I chose fleeting emotions over fighting for what was real. The days passed in monotony. I no longer worked in design. My job had ceased to bring me joy. The nights became unbearably long. I sat in an empty house surrounded by memories, and every corner reminded me of what I had lost. The place that had once been our home had now become a prison filled only with pain and regret. Sometimes I would go out for a walk down the street passing by Victor's house, but I never stopped. Our paths no longer crossed. Surely he also understood that our past had no meaning or future. My days were like a black and white movie, devoid of bright colors, and each step reminded me of my mistake. Once I had dreamed of a new life, of new emotions, of feeling alive. But now all I had left was emptiness and the bitter realization that I was the one who destroyed my own happiness. I was the cause of all my suffering. In the end, I understood a simple truth. Happiness isn't about fleeting sparks of passion and excitement. It isn't something new and thrilling. It's the small moments we build with those who stand by us, and I let that slip away. Instead of fighting for my marriage, I let myself be carried away by a momentary passion, and that led to my complete ruin. Now I was left alone and had to live with it. Live with the knowledge that I was the one who destroyed my life. I often thought of Martin, of our best moments, of how we made plans for the future, of how he smiled when I told him my dreams, and each time it caused me unbearable pain, because those memories were all I had left of our life together. My betrayal destroyed everything, but I made my choice, and I would have to live with its consequences. If I could give a piece of advice, it would be just one thing. Don't make my mistakes. Don't let fleeting passions destroy what you've built over years, because a single mistake can destroy everything you once loved. Now, all I have left is this: the silence and the pain that accompany me every day.